Hey guys, I'm back with a new video. In this video, we will make 10 applications. If you are new to the channel, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to get the notification for all the latest uploads. So enough of talking, let us start making the projects in this video. Now for each of these 10 projects, I will be providing you HTML, CSS for them. So you can find them in the course files. Whatever thing requires explanation, I will cover that there and then, so that we all are on the same page. Now in each of these 10 projects, we will be strongly focusing on the DOM concepts. So first one is a modal, where we will be using the concepts of DOM and JavaScript classes that we have already discussed in great depth. The link for the complete JavaScript playlist series can be found down below. So I've already opened the project in Visual Studio Code, and here are the styles file and the index.html file. And currently we are having just this button. So on the click of button, we want to open the modal, and when the user clicks outside the modal on the backdrop or on the cross icon, then we want to close the modal. So you can find the HTML and CSS for the projects in the repository. Now once you have copied the HTML and CSS for the project, create a new file in the project folder 1.modals and name it as app.js. Let us first add an event listener on the window object and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once the DOM content gets completely loaded, let us trigger the function initialize app. So let us define a new function and name it as initialize app. We don't need to add anything right here just yet. Next, let us create a modal class. So class modal, and let us define our constructor function, and this will receive the modal instance that we will create in just a minute. So let us set up some properties for the new instance. Now the first thing is to set up a modal wrapper property on the modal instance. So this dot modal wrapper, and set this to modal dot parent element. So if you see the index.html file, this is our modal, and the parent element of this is modal container, which is the modal wrapper. Is the open button, which we will use to display the modal once the user clicks on the open button. So for this we can say this dot open button modal dot parent element. So modal dot parent element gives us the modal container, and if we see the previous element sibling of the modal container, then that is this button, right? Which is this button that is getting rendered in the browser. So to get a reference for this, we can say dot previous element sibling. Next is the close button, which we will use to hide the modal once the user clicks on the close button. So let us set this to the first element child of the modal. So here you can see this is the modal, right? And if you see the first element child of this modal, then it is this close modal div, right? So this is our cross icon, and once the user clicks on this cross icon, the modal will get closed, right? So this dot close button modal dot first element child. Finally, we also have the submit button for the modal. So this dot submit button. So on the modal DOM object, we can apply the query selector method and grab a reference to the submit button, which is hash modal submit. So if you see this in the index.html file, this is our modal. You apply a query selector on this, and we are looking for a button with an ID of modal submit, which is our submission button, right? So we are grabbing a reference to the submit button, and the submit button also closes the modal. Now let us add a init method in our modal class. So init, and here let us trigger a method that will perform the event bindings for our modal. So this dot do event bindings. So right here let us add a method that does the event bindings for our modal. So do event bindings. So first let us listen for the click event on the open button. So this dot open button dot add event listener, and once the click event happens on the open button, it triggers the show modal method. So this dot show modal, and let us bind this method that we are going to define in just a minute to our class. So dot bind and this. So right here let us define the show modal method, and here let us log to the console opening the modal. Now in order to display the modal, we just need to set the display CSS property for the modal wrapper to block. So in the style.css file, we have the modal container with a display property of none. So that is why it is initially invisible. Let us make it visible once the user clicks on the click here button to show the modal. So in order to display the modal, we just need to set the display CSS property for the modal wrapper to block. So this dot modal wrapper dot style dot display, set this to block. So now it will only become visible once the user clicks on the open button that runs this show modal method. Next, let us listen for the click event on the close button. So this dot close button, and once the click event happens on the close button, let us trigger the close modal method on the class. So bind it to the class like this, and right below the show modal method, let us define the close modal method, and here let us log to the console closing the modal. Now in order to hide the modal, we just need to set the display CSS property of the modal wrapper to none. So once we set the display property back to none, it again becomes hidden, right? Next, let us listen for the click event on the submit button. So this dot submit button dot add event listener, and once the click event happens on the button, let us close the modal by running the method close modal and bind this to the class like this. Now let us go right inside the initialize app function and let us create a new variable and then make use of the new keyword to create a new modal instance. Let me name the variable as modal. Now to this, we need to pass a reference to the modal DOM object. So let us query select the modal and pass the obtained reference to the modal constructor. Document dot query selector dot modal. And now before testing our code, let us trigger the init method on the modal instance like this. So let us preview this in the browser. Now if we click on the click here button, you can see the modal immediately pops up, and if you click on the cross icon or the buy now button, it immediately closes the modal that was opened. Now lastly, we want that once the user clicks on the modal wrapper, which is this backdrop that is outside the modal, we again want to close the modal. So for this, we need to listen for the click event on the backdrop or on the window object and check to see if the user clicked on the backdrop or something else. So if the user clicked on the backdrop, we want to close the modal. So let us go to the do event bindings method and register a listener for this as well. So right here, let us listen for the click event on the window object. So window dot add event listener. So once the user clicks somewhere, we want to check the target of the event. So if the target of the event is the modal wrapper, which serves as the backdrop, so for this we can say event, and if event dot target is equals to this dot modal wrapper, which is the backdrop, then we set the display property for the modal wrapper to none. So if the target is our modal wrapper, we close our modal, or instead of this we can simply call the close modal method that we defined above like this. Else, if the target is something other than the backdrop, we can simply return false like this. So let us preview this in the browser. So if I click on the button, the modal pops up, click on the backdrop, the modal closes. Now let us listen for the key down event on the window object. And once that gets triggered, let us check for the key that was pressed. So event, if event dot key is triple equal to the escape key. So once the user presses the escape key, we want to close the modal, right? So this escape key is a key that is present in the top left corner of the keypad. So let us invoke the close modal method in order to hide the modal when the user presses the escape key. So this is how we can close the modal once the user clicks outside the modal or presses the escape key. So this is how we can close the modal once the user clicks outside the modal, specifically on the backdrop or the wrapper of the modal. And also the modal will get closed when the user presses an escape key. We run the function close modal. So let us give this a whirl. So we click on the button, the modal pops up. So for testing this out, let us open the on-screen keyboard and press the escape key. So let us click on the modal button, press on the escape key, and you can see the modal gets closed. So you can see everything works like a charm. So now we are done with our first project. Let us move to the second project where we implement a tabs system. So let us move forward to our second project. In this project we will implement a tabs system. The idea here is that we will have 3 tabs and the user will click on one of the tabs, present in the tabs panel, and once the tab gets clicked, we want to activate that tab and show its content. On the first load of the page, you can see the about tab is active and its content is getting rendered in this container. So we have an active class on the about tab button right here and on the content pertaining to the about tab, right? It also has a class of active, that is why this is getting rendered in the tabs container. So in the 2 tabs folder, create a new file app.js and let us first add an event listener on the window object. So window.add event listener and listen for the DOM content loaded event, and once the DOM content gets completely loaded, let us trigger the function initialize app. So right here let us define the initialize app function. For now let us leave the code block for the function as empty. We'll come to this a bit later. Let us add a class and name it as tabs. And let us add a constructor function first. So constructor. Now the constructor function will run implicitly under the hood and will create a new instance of the tabs class, and we will perform some initialization of properties on the tab instance. So this will take a container which will be this div with the class of container that we will pass to the constructor. So let us add a container property on the tabs instance that we are about to create and set this to the container that we receive as the argument in the constructor like this. Next we want to grab the list of all the tab buttons that are present in the tab panel. So these 3 tab buttons. For this, let us make use of the query selector all on the container DOM object. So container.query selector all, and look for the tab buttons using the class of trigger. So you can see each button has a class of trigger. So the query selector all will give us a node list. Let us transform this to an array using array.from method array.from, and whatever we get back, let us store this in a property tab buttons on the instance that we are about to create. Next we need a method to activate the tab once the user clicks on some tab button. So if the user clicks on the contact tab button, then we want to render its content right here. For this we will define a method later. So activate tab and show its content, and let us bind it to the class right within the constructor. So this dot activate tab and show its content. Use the bind method and bind it to the class by passing the this keyword. Finally, we need one more method to handle tab change. So once the user presses the tab key that we have on our keypad, we want to switch from the current tab to the next tab. So for this, we can have a method handle tab change, this dot handle tab change, and bind it to the class like this. So let us go right within our initialize app function and create a new instance of the tabs class before we start writing our methods for the tab class. So right inside the initialize app function, let us create a new variable const tabs, and let us store a reference to the new instance of the tabs class inside it. So to create a new tabs instance, we can make use of the new keyword followed by the class name, and here we need to pass the container DOM object, for which we can grab a reference by saying document.querySelector.container. Next, let us perform the event bindings for our UI elements For this, let us define a method right inside our class and name it as doEventBindings. So tabs.doEventBindings, and go within the class to define it. So here you can see we are selecting a div with a class of container. We are passing it to the constructor. So we set the container, which is this DOM object. Now within this div, we look for all the tab buttons with a class of trigger. So we get an array of that and store it within the tab buttons property. Then we have these two methods that are basically for changing the tabs on the click of buttons. So right inside the doEventBindings method, let us cycle over each of our tabs using a for each method. So this dot tab buttons for each tab button. So for each such tab button, let us register two event listeners, one for the click event. So tab button dot add event listener, and on the click event, we want to trigger the function this dot activate tab and show its content. Next, we also want that once the user presses the tab key, we want the ability to switch the tabs and render the content for the tab that becomes active. So tab dot add event listener, let us listen for the key up event, and once that happens, let us trigger the function handle tab change. So first thing first, let us define the activate tab and show its content method, and this will receive the event object as the argument. So activate tab and show its content. So right inside the function, let us first remove the active class from each of the tab buttons to be extra safe that only the tab button that gets clicked later gets the active class on it. So this dot tab buttons for each tab button dot class list dot remove the class of active. So we know that the tab buttons are these three buttons. We cycle over them, and for each such tab button, we remove the class of active. Currently, we have the active class on the very first tab, so we remove that, and all other tabs do not have this active class. So there is a better way to achieve this. So let us try this. Instead of iterating over all the tab buttons, let us grab the only tab button that has the active class and remove the active class from it, instead of cycling over all the tab buttons, because all the tab buttons might not have this class of active, as can be seen right here. So let us apply the better approach here. So the second way can be this dot on the container. Let us apply query selector and look for a button with a class of active. So this is our container, and on this container we apply the query selector, and we are looking for a button with a class of active. So we get this button, right? And now we have the button. We can do the same thing of removing the class. So dot class list dot remove active. Now once a tab button gets clicked, let us assign the class of active to the tab button which gets clicked. So to get the button that gets clicked, we can say event dot current target. So this gives us the button that was clicked, and to that button let us add the class of active like this. So now the button that gets clicked has the class of active, and all other buttons will not have this class. Now as a next step, let us remove the active class from each of the tabs. So now we want to remove the active class from each of these divs. One way could be to iterate over all the divs and remove this class of active, and I will show you both the ways. And the other way could be to directly query select this div and remove the class of active. So let us see both the ways in action. So the first way is to, on the container, let us apply the query selector all method and look for all the divs that have the class of tab, and for each such tab div that holds the content, let us remove the class of active from the current tab div. So tab div dot class list dot remove active. Now this is very much similar to the first way that we did for the buttons. Now here you can see we are iterating over all the tab divs with the class of content, and we are removing the class of active. Now as in the case of buttons, there are divs that don't have the class of active. So removing the class of active on such divs that don't already have them doesn't make sense, right? So instead of iterating over all the container divs, let us only remove the class of active from the div that actually has one. So here we can use the second way, dot container, and on the container let us apply the query selector method and look for a div with a class of active. Now this directly gives us a div that has a class of active. So we get this div, and on this div we access the class list and remove this class of active. So dot class list dot remove active. Now the next step is to make sure that once the user clicks on one of the tab buttons, corresponding div with its tab content gets rendered in the browser. So let us first get the value of the data target attribute that is present on the button that was clicked. So suppose if this contact button gets clicked, we want to get the data target attribute, which is hash contact, and we can query select the div that has this hash contact ID, which will give us this div, and we can make it active, right? So let us see how we can achieve this. So this data target attribute will give us a selector. So const selector, the button that gets clicked can be accessed by saying event.currentTarget, and let us get the attribute data target. Now once we have this data target attribute, we can make use of the query selector method on the container DOM object and pass the selector that we get, which is the data target attribute, and look for a content div with the ID of selector that we get from this data target attribute, and this gives us the tab to which, if we add the active class, will make it active and hence render its content. So let us store this in content variable, and now to render the content of the tab we can say content.classlist.add the class of active. So now we are done with the implementation of this method. Let us give this a preview in the browser. So let us click on the contact tab button. Let me click on inspect. Okay, so we are getting an error, cannot read property bind of undefined at line 13. So let me comment this out first because we are not having this method as of now. Let us make a reload. Uncaught reference error, tab is not defined 18. So this should be tab button. Now let us click on the tabs. Okay, so we are still getting some errors. Let us rectify them. It says container is not defined, so line 32. This should be this dot container. And now finally try this out. Now if I click on the contact tab button, its content gets rendered within the tab div. Click on the home tab button and you can see everything works like a charm. Now as a final step, let us make sure that once the user presses the tab key on the keypad, we are able to switch the tabs. For this we need to define the handle tab change function. Let me uncomment this, and right here let us define the handle tab change function, and this will receive the event object. Here we just need to check whether it was the tab key that was pressed or not. So for this let us make use of the which property on the event object that indicates which key was pressed. Let me log event.which to the console and let us give this a whirl. Let me press tab and you can see it gives us a value of 9, which corresponds to the tab key. Now here we just need to check if the key that was pressed is the tab key. So event.which, if it is equal to 9, then let us invoke the activate tab and show its content method to render a tab with its content and pass the event object to it. Now in order to test, let me open the on-screen keyboard and let us give this a preview in the browser. Now if I click on each of the tab buttons, you can see the tabs are getting changed. If I click on the tab key, you can see the tabs are getting changed. So you can see everything works like a charm. Let's move forward to our third project. Now let us start working on our range sliders project. So the idea here is that user will select the values of 4 components: red, green, blue and opacity, for which we have the range sliders. As you can see, on adjusting the values of these 4 components, we need to change the background in the browser, right? So let us head over to the app.js file and define the code for this. So let us first add an event listener on the window object and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once the DOM content gets completely loaded, let us trigger an anonymous function. So function So right here, let us define the useSliders function, and right inside it grab the DOM references for all the sliders that we have in our HTML. So let us create a slider1 variable and set this to the query selector operation and pass to it the ID of the first slider, so hash slider1. So here in HTML you can see the ID of the first slider, which is slider1, and then similarly let us do this for all other 3 sliders. So const slider2 document query selector hash slider2, const slider3 document query selector hash slider3, and const slider4 document query selector hash slider4. So now we have the references to each of our slider DOM objects. Let us return them in form of an array. So return slider1, slider2, slider3, and slider4. So right here, let us define an update color function to change the background of the browser when the user changes the values for the 4 components using range sliders. So function update color, and right inside the update color function, let us invoke the useSliders function, and this returns us an array having the DOM references for all our sliders. And on the returned array, let us make use of the map method, and for each slider that we have, which is our input element, we need to access the next element sibling of the slider. So let us see what the next element sibling is for the current slider. So let us say the current slider is this one. If we say next element sibling of this slider, then it is this paragraph, and then we need to query select the span tag that we have within this paragraph and the inner HTML of it to get this value of the component pertaining to the slider. So we can say slider dot next element sibling dot look for the span within this paragraph and grab the inner HTML, which gives us the value for the component. So for each slider we will get this value. So in total we will have 4 values for each of our components. So first value will be for the red component. Let us collect that. Then green component, blue component, and finally the opacity component. Let me zoom this out. So now we have the values for each of our 4 components that the user can change using the range sliders. Now to change the color of the background, we can simply say document.body.style.background color and set this to a template string, and let us use the RGBA CSS function and pass the values that we got for each of our 4 components into it. So first we interpolate the red component, then comma the green component, then let us interpolate the blue component, and finally the opacity, so opacity component. So now we are done with our implementation of the update color method. To see this in action, let us grab all the DOM references by saying useSliders dot for each, and for each slider let us invoke the bind event and set value function. So function bind event and set value, and this will take on a slider object each time. Now on each slider let us listen for the input event, and once that occurs, let us change the displayed value for the component that the slider represents. So slider dot next element sibling dot query selector. So we need to look for the span tag and get the inner HTML for this to get the current value, and whatever value the user selects, we set that to the inner HTML of the span for the slider. So each time we are adjusting the value for this, you can see we are changing the value because here the input event is getting fired, right? And once the input event gets fired, we access the next element sibling of the slider, look for the span tag and change the value. And finally we need to update the color of the background. So we can call the update color function that we had defined above. So let us give this a preview in the browser. So if I change the value of the red component, you can see the background is getting changed. And here in the right you can see the values are also getting adjusted. If I change the value of green, if I change the value of the blue component and change the opacity as well, you can see the color of the background is changing. So now you can see everything works like a charm. Let us head over to the fourth project. Now let us see a demo for the fourth project that we are going to make in this video. This is a slideshow project which we will implement using classes. The idea here is to change slides once the user clicks on the arrows. So we can go back and we can go forward. Here we also need to check for the ends of the slides. So if we are at the end of the slideshow and the user clicks on the rightward arrow, then we want to take the user to the first slide. And if the user is at the start of the slideshow and clicks on the leftward arrow, then we want to take the user to the last slide, right? So you can grab the HTML and CSS for this project in the course repository files. Now inside the slideshow folder, create a new file app.js. Let us first add an event listener on the window object. So window.add-event-listener, and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once the DOM content gets completely loaded, let us trigger the function initialize app. So for now, let us leave the body of the initialize app function as it is, and let's create a new class slideshow. So class slideshow, and right inside it define the constructor function, and this will receive the slideshow div, which is this one that holds all the slides that we have in the HTML. So constructor slideshow. Now let us add some properties to the slideshow instance that we want to create. So first let us set the slideshow property on the slideshow instance to the slideshow DOM reference that we will receive as an argument to the constructor function right here. Next we need to grab the outer div that holds all the slides that we have in the slideshow. So if I go back to the index.html file, you can see we have this slides div that holds all the slides within it. So for this, let us apply the query selector on the slideshow DOM reference and look for a div with the class of slides and set this to the slides property on the slideshow instance like this. Next we also need a reference to the previous and next buttons, which are these two buttons. So to grab the previous button on the slideshow, we have the next element sibling property, and on the next sibling that we get, let us apply the query selector operation and look for an element with an ID of prev. So let us see what this gives us. So this is our slideshow. If we access the next element sibling property on it, we get this div. And if we apply query selector on this div and look for something with an ID of prev, then we get this button, right? Which is the leftward arrow. So we can store this in previous button. And let us do the same thing for the next button. So let me copy this and paste it down below and change this to next button. And we can again get this by saying slideshow.nextElementSibling.querySelector and look for an element with the ID of next. Now the next steps are to initialize the current, previous and next slides. So for the current slide, let us apply the query selector on the slideshow and look for a div with the class of current. So query selector dot current. Now if we don't have a div with the class of current, in that case we can make the first slide as our current slide. So to make the first slide as the current slide, we can access the slides property, and on it we can say first element child. So if we don't have any slide with the class of current, then we can make the first slide as the current slide, right? So this dot slides will give us this div, and if we apply the first element child, then we will get this div, But in the initial setup, you can see we are having this div with the class of current, right? And let us set this to this dot current slide. Now once we have a current slide, in order to get the previous slide, we can access the previous element sibling property on the current slide. So this dot current slide dot previous element sibling. So here you can see that the first div within the slides div is having the class of current. If we try to find the previous element sibling of it, then we get nothing, right? So for this case, if the current slide doesn't have a previous slide, in that case, we want the last slide to be the previous slide, which is practically this one, right? Let us do this. So if our current slide doesn't have the previous slide, let us make the last slide as the previous slide. So this dot slides dot last element child. So these are the two cases for the previous slide. Now let us talk about the next slide. In order to get the next slide, we can access the next element sibling on the current slide if we do have a next slide with respect to the current slide. So as an example, you can see this is our current slide. If we access the next element sibling on this slide, we get this div. But what if the current slide is this one? Then if you apply the next element sibling on it, then we don't have any slide that is next to this slide, right? So in that case, we need to make the first slide as the next slide. So if we do have a next slide with respect to the current slide, then we can say this dot current slide dot next element sibling. Else if the last slide is the current slide, then to get the next slide of the last slide, which is the current slide, we can say this dot slides dot first element child. So these are the two cases for the next slide. Now whatever slides we have got for the current, previous and next slides, let us add classes to mark them as current, previous and next slides respectively. So let us say this dot current slide dot class list dot add a class of current. So this dot previous slide dot class list dot add a class of previous, and to the next slide let us add the class of next. So right at the initialization step, let us understand these three lines of code. Previous slide. Now let us understand the case that we have. In our case, we have 3 slides. And the first one has the class of current. So this is our current slide. Now for this current slide, if we want to find the previous slide, we don't have any previous element sibling of this current slide, right? So as per our code, we make the last element child as the previous slide relative to this current slide, right? Which is this slide. So previous slide becomes this one. And in the constructor, we give the previous class to this slide, right? Now if I talk about the next slide, for the current slide, we do have a next element sibling, which is this one. So we make this as the next slide. And right at the time of initialization, we give this slide the next class. So this is the state of our slideshow at the initialization time, which is that the first slide is the current slide, this is the next slide, and if we talk about the previous slide, then the third slide is the previous slide. So if you click on the left button on this, then this slide should pop up, right? So now we understand whatever we wrote in the constructor function. Let us define a doEventBindings method and bind the arrow buttons that we have in our slides so that the user is able to change the slides when these buttons get clicked. So right here, let us add a doEventBindings method and register event listeners for the click event on both our buttons. So on the previous button, this dot previous button dot add event listener, let us listen for the click event, and once that happens, let us trigger the switch slide function that I will define in just a minute. So let us pass an arrow function, this dot switch slide, and to the switch slide method, let us pass an argument which will determine the direction in which we want to move. So let this be a number. So if the number is 0, we move to the left direction, else if the number is 1, then we move to the right direction. So for moving to the right, we need to add an event listener on the next button. And once the click event happens, let us trigger the function this.switchSlide and pass an argument of 1 to move to the right direction, right? So let us go right at the top and define the switchSlide method. So right here, let us define the switchSlide method, and this will take on a direction argument using which we will determine how to move the slider, whether to move to the left or to the right. So first, let us remove all the previous, current and next classes that we had initialized within the constructor on our previous current and next slide. So to be on the safer side, let us remove all these 3 classes if they are present on any of the slides, right? So let us define a constant, and here let us define an array of classes: previous, current and next. Now let us log the previous and next slides to the console. So console.log previous slide, this.previous slide and current slide, this.current slide. Now in order to remove these classes, let us access the class list property on the previous, current and next slides and apply the remove method. So this.previous slide dot class list dot remove, and pass on these classes to remove them from each of the 3 slides respectively. So let us use the spread operator to convert this to a string and pass each of these classes as separate arguments. Then this dot current slide dot class list dot remove triple dot classes, and this dot next slide dot class list dot remove classes, like this. Now comes the important part. Here we need to make the move. So we need to check for the direction argument. If it is 0, then we want to make a left move. So if the direction is 0, now in order to make a move in the left direction, we need to change our previous slide to the previous of the previous slide that we currently have, which means that if you are on this slide and you click on the left button, then what happens is that this slide will go right here and this slide will go right here. So the previous slide will now become the previous element sibling of the slide that is currently the previous slide, right? So this means that this dot previous slide will become the previous element sibling of the slide that is currently the previous slide, right? That means, now consider the scenario when the first slide is the previous slide. In that case, if we click on the left button, our new previous slide will be this one, right? So if we take this case where we don't have a previous element sibling for our current previous slide, then we can have a new previous slide as this dot slides dot last element child, right? Which is the last slide. Now if I talk about the current slide, which is currently this one, and we make a left move, then whatever we have currently as the previous slide will become the current slide. So this dot current slide equals this dot previous slide, and whatever we have the next slide will become the current slide if we make the left move. So if you make the left move, the current slide will become the previous slide and the current next slide will become our current slide, right? Now coming to the else case, if we want to move to the right direction, whatever we have as the current slide at the moment, which is this one, if you click on the right button, then what will happen is that this previous slide will come here and the current slide will move right here. So the previous slide will become our current slide and our current slide will become the next slide, and the next slide will become the next element sibling of the current next slide, which will be this one, right? So I hope you are understanding the flow that we are discussing right here. So we can say this dot previous slide, this dot current slide, this dot current slide, this dot next slide, and this dot next slide, this dot next slide dot next element sibling. So in essence, whatever we have the current slide at the moment, we make it the previous slide because we are moving in the right direction. Next, the next slide that we currently have will become the current slide. Let us assume that the next slide doesn't have a next element sibling. So let me map this right here. If we have these three slides, and let us say this is our previous slide, this is our current slide, and this is our next slide. So if our next slide doesn't have a next element sibling, then in order to get the next slide, once the user clicks on the next button, we can say this dot slides dot first element child, which gives us this slide, right? Because we don't have any slide next to the current next slide. Okay, so we don't have any slide next to this slide. So this dot slides dot first element child. So now we are done with adjusting our slides. Let us log them to the console first. Current slide, this dot current slide, console.log previous slide. Let me log this here. So this dot previous slide and next slide, this dot next slide. And finally, let us apply the current, previous and next classes to the current slide, previous slide and the next slide that we got from the above logic. So this dot previous slide dot class list dot add previous. Now to the current slide, we need to add the class current, and to the next slide we need to add the class of next. Now before we try this out, let us go to our initialize app function and create a new instance for our slideshow and set up the event bindings for our slideshow. So right here, let us create a new variable and name it as slideshow and assign to it a new instance of the slideshow class. So new slideshow, and to it pass a DOM reference that we get by query selecting our div with the class of slideshow. Now to set up the event bindings, let us invoke the doEventBindings method on the slideshow instance that we just created, like this. So let us give this a whirl. So if I click on the right arrow, you can see we are able to change the slides. Once we reach the third slide, then we want to switch back to the first slide. So if I click on the right button again, we are back to the first slide. If I click on the previous button, we are back to the last slide. So you can see everything works like a charm. So finally, let us make sure that when the user presses the left or the right arrow keys present on the keypad, then also we are able to change the slides. So right inside the doEventBindings function, let us listen for the keyUp event on the window object. So window.addEventListener, and listen for the keyUp event on the window object. And once that happens, let us trigger the function handle keyUp. So this dot handle keyUp, and bind it to the class, or you can use an arrow function as well to make sure that this function runs on the class. So right here, let us define the handle keyUp method. So handle keyUp, and this will receive the event object. So on the event object, we have the information regarding which key was pressed. So let us make use of this information. So on the event object, we have a key property, and if that equals arrow right, then let us invoke the switch slide method with the value of 1 to move to the right direction. Else if the key pressed is the left arrow key, so if event.key is arrow left, then we invoke the switch slide function with the value of 0. So let us give this a preview in the browser. Now let me open the on-screen keyboard and try this out. So if I click on the right arrow, which is this one, you can see our slide is getting changed. Again click on it, it works. So click on the left arrow and you can see everything works like a charm. So now we are done with the fourth project. Let us move to our fifth project, where we will create a salary calculator of an employee. The idea for this project is to compute the various components in form of allowances based on certain percentages from the salary that the user will input. So we have a simple input field where the user will enter the salary, and then we will apply some operations to compute various allowances. So let us create two folders and make use of the model view controller architecture. Let us create a new folder, models, and inside the models folder, let us create a new file, calculator.modal.js, and let us also create a new folder, controllers, and inside this, let us create a new file, calculator.controller.js. Now right inside the calculator.controller file, let us first add an event listener on the window object and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once the DOM content gets completely loaded, let us trigger the function initialize app. Now let us create our initialize app function and define a populate zeros function to populate an initial value of 0 in all the spans that we are having right here. So right here, let us create the populate zeros function and reach out to the DOM to grab all the span tags. So we use query selector all, and this gives us a node list containing all the span tags that we have on the page. Let us store this in a variable const spans. Now for each span that we have on the page, let us set the inner HTML of the current span that we are on to 0. So span.innerHTML, set this to 0. So initially we are not getting anything. So let us go to our CSS file, and in the CSS file, let us comment this so that we can see the details info and go back to the browser. So here is our details container. Now in order to make this controller work, let us import the script in our index.html file. So right at the top, let us add a script src controllers / calculator.controller.js and add the defer attribute. Now let us give this a whirl, and you can see we are getting the value of 0 being populated in all the span tags. Next, right inside the initialize app function, let us invoke our doEventBindings function. And let us define it down below to bind the events on our UI elements. So right here, let us add the doEventBindings function. And inside here, let us reach out to the DOM to grab a reference for the compute salary button, which is this one. So document.querySelector hash compute and register a listener on it. So add event listener. And once the click event happens on the button, let us trigger a function compute salary. So right here, let us define the compute salary function. Now the very first step is to set the details info display property to none. So document.querySelector, select the details info container and set the display property to none. So initially we don't want to display the details because we are yet to compute that. Now the very first step here is to reach out to the DOM and grab a reference to our input control and tap the value that we have inside it. Let us store this in a variable and let us name it as input salary. So document query selector salary dot value. So this is our input control with an ID of salary, and we are grabbing the value that we have inside it. Now let us create a model file inside the models folder, which is calculator.modal.js, and let us also add it at the top as a script src models calculator.modal.js and defer. Let us put this at the top. Now this model file will house all our methods, and the controller will serve as the glue between the view, which is our HTML code, and the model that we will define in just a minute. So right inside the model file, let us create a new constant and name it as salary ops. And inside it, let us define a salary property and set this to 0 as the initial value. Let us define a set takeaway salary function, and this will receive the salary that the user will input in the input field. And let us set our salary property of the salary ops object to the salary we get as an argument. Now let us define a couple of methods to get the value for certain allowances. Each allowance will be a certain percentage of the salary that the user enters. So let us define a get house rental allowance function, and this will compute the house rental allowance. So let us take it as 30% of the salary that the user inputs. So return this dot salary into 0.3. Next, let us add a get dearness allowance method to compute the dearness allowance, and let this be 20% of the salary that the user inputs. So this dot salary into 0.2. Next, let us add a get travel allowance function to compute the travel allowance, and let this be 30% of the salary that the user inputs. Next, let us add a get provident fund function to compute the provident fund, and let this be 5% of the salary that the user enters. Next, let us compute the gross salary of the employee. So this will be equal to the salary that the user inputs. So this dot salary plus the house rental allowance, which we can get by saying this dot get house rental allowance, plus the dearness allowance. So this dot get dearness allowance, and let me write this at the bottom. This dot get travel allowance minus the provident fund. So this dot get provident fund. Next, let us add a function to compute the tax on the gross salary that we just computed above, and let this be 10% of the gross salary of the employee. So get tax, return this dot get gross salary, and multiply this with 0.1. Finally, let us add a function to compute the net salary of the employee. So get net salary. So this will be gross salary of the employee, which we can get by saying this dot get gross salary minus the tax that the user pays. So this dot get tax. And now let us head over to our controller file and use these methods there. So right inside the compute salary function, we are having the input salary with us that we get from the user from the input box. So right here, let us invoke our set takeaway salary method that we have in our model file. So salary ops dot set takeaway salary, which is a method in our model file, and this expects a salary. So let us pass the input salary to it to set our takeaway salary, and let us make use of the parse float method to convert the salary into a float number, because we know whatever we get from the input control by default is a string, so we need to convert it into a number because salary in the end is a number. So let me wrap this in parse float like this. And now let us define the print result function to print the value for all the components in a field set. So document.query selector hash details info dot style dot display, and set this to block. And now to print the result, let us invoke the print result function. Now right here, let us define the print result function, and let us iterate over all the keys of the salary ops object. So all the keys, as you can see, here we have a field and then we have our methods. So we need to iterate over all the keys of the salary ops object and then execute the methods that are present in the salary ops object and populate the values for all the components in our result by actually running these functions, right? So let us make use of a for in loop to iterate over all the keys of the salary ops object. So for let key in salary ops, so if the key is the string salary, which you can see we are having right here, this is not a method, so we cannot run this. Let us make use of the continue keyword for this key. So the continue keyword here will abandon the current iteration and will start with the next iteration, right? Next, if any property of the salary ops object is a function, so for checking that we can say type of salary ops key. If this is a function, let us invoke the function dynamically and populate each of our spans with the values of the components that we get. But before that, we also need to check if the key matches the string set takeaway salary. Because this is a setter method, we don't want to run this. We only want to run these functions that give us actual results, right? The set takeaway salary function was already executed when we set the initial value of the takeaway salary. So here also, let us copy this and paste it right here. And if the key is the name of the function that is a setter method set takeaway salary, then we don't need to invoke the function pertaining to this key and instead continue. So we abandon the current iteration again and begin with the next iteration. Else for all other keys, we need to invoke the functions pertaining to each keys other than the above two and populate the result in our spans. So let us make use of the query selector operation and pass the key. Now the thing here is that the key that we have in the salary ops object, like get house rental allowance, get dearness allowance, get travel allowance, and so on, these keys match with the ID property that we have on our spans. So get house rental allowance, get dearness allowance, and so on. So we can take this to our advantage. So using this, we can dynamically populate our spans by running the functions corresponding to those keys in the salary ops object. So salary ops pass the key to run this. So if the key is get house rental allowance, then it will run the method that we have on the salary ops object pertaining to the key get house rental allowance, will return this result, and then we can store it to something that we have in the left. Now that something is also selected by the same key. So say this key is get house rental allowance. So if we use query selector, then we will get this span tag, and whatever result we get from this invocation, we set that to the inner HTML of the span, right? And this line of code gets executed for each of our methods starting from line 6 onwards. So all these getter methods, this line of code will get executed. So now we are done with the implementation. Let us give this a preview. So let us enter a salary and click on compute salary. So you can see it says cannot read property style of null. Okay, so we are getting an error 14. Let me check the index.html file. Okay, so it is details _info. Let us again go back to the browser and click on compute salary. Okay, one more error. Here we need to use backticks, right? Because we are interpolating the key that we are getting from the salary ops object, and that key matches to one of our input IDs. So we are dynamically using it to select a span and set the inner HTML to the result that we get for our allowances, right? Okay, so let me again enter some value, and here we need a dollar as well, and you can see the results are getting logged in the details information container. Let us leave this as blank and then compute salary. For this case, you can see we are getting the nan values. So let us handle this as well. And suppose if the user enters some invalid salary and clicks on compute salary, then again we get nan. So we have to handle these two cases in our compute salary function. So right here we can check if the input salary dot trim, so we trim it at both the ends, and check for the length. If the length comes out to be 0, Then we can query select the h2 with an ID of message to render the error message. Let us set the inner HTML of this h2 to please enter an amount. Else, next let us check if the salary the user enters is a valid one or not. So if the user enters numbers, then it is a valid one, otherwise it is invalid one. So if the salary that the user enters is not a number, so we can say 2 forward slashes and then \d. This represents number, and then we use the test method on the regex that we just defined and see if the salary satisfies this or not. So parse float input salary. So here we are using a bang on this. So if the input salary is not a valid one, so it is not numeric in nature, let us set the message.innerHTML to only digits are allowed. Now once if the length of the input is 0, we can return immediately, and for this case as well, so that the rest of the function doesn't get executed, right? So let us head over to the browser to see if this works or not. So let me click on compute salary. It says please enter an amount. Next, if we add some random characters and click on compute salary, we get only digits are allowed. Let us reload this. Now finally we want to hide this details information container if the user hasn't entered anything in the input field. So for this, let us go back to our app.css file and uncomment this and go back to the browser, and you can see it's gone. So let us finally test our functionality. So let me say 2 lakh and compute salary. So you get the house rental allowance, the DNS allowance, the travel allowance, and all other things. If I leave this as empty and click on compute salary, you can see it says please enter an amount. And if I enter some ZBrush characters and click on compute salary, it says only digits are allowed. So you can see everything works like a charm. So let us move forward to our 6th project. In this project, let us create a scroll indicator. So the HTML and CSS for the project can be found in the course files. So grab them and create a new file in 6 scroll indicator and name it as app.js. Let us first add an event listener on the window object. So window.add event listener and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once the DOM content gets completely loaded, let us trigger the function initialize app. Now right inside the initialize app function, let us invoke the function do event bindings, and this function will set up the event bindings for our UI elements. So right here, let us now define the do event bindings function, and let us register an event listener for the scroll event on the window object. And once that happens, let us trigger the function change progress. So the idea here is that once you scroll down, we want this scroll indicator, which is present at the top, to show some progress, right? So if you scroll by a little amount, then there should be a thick line representing some progress. And once we scroll down completely, that thick line should reach at the end of the progress bar, right? So in order to achieve this, let us add the change progress function right here. And here we need to do some computations, and based on the percentage of scroll that happens, we want to map that percentage to show how much scroll happened using the scroll indicator. So for this, let us first create a variable and name it as units scrolled from top and set this to document.body.scroll top. Next, we need the difference between the scroll height and the client height. So document.body.scroll height minus document.body.client height. And let us store this in a variable height. And let me Google this for you to explain what these two terms actually mean. Now here, if you see this answer, it says the scroll height is a measurement of the height of an element's content, including the content not visible on the screen due to overflow. So it takes the complete height and even includes the content that is not visible on the screen, right? Which is overflowing. and we are subtracting the client height from that for the document body. So the client height is the inner height of an element. In this case, it is the body element in pixel. That includes the padding but not the horizontal scroll bar height, border or margin, right? So let us log both of them to the console to understand this better. Client height document dot body dot client height and scroll height document dot body dot scroll height. And let us also log the units scrolled from top and the height. So let us preview this in the browser. Let me open the inspect tab and let us scroll. So here you can see the client height is 881, okay, and the scroll height is 1109. So we are actually taking the difference of the scroll height and the client height, so it comes out to be 228. And here you can see the units that we scrolled from the top. So let us make a complete scroll. And you can see these are the units that we scrolled from the top. So our scroll bar went from top to bottom, that is to the end of the page, and these are the units that we scrolled from top to bottom. Now to compute how much percentage we have scrolled, let us divide the units scrolled from top by the height that we got and multiply this with 100, and let us store this in a variable percentage scrolled. And finally, let us dynamically change the width of the progress bar based on the percentage by which we have scrolled from the top. So for this, let us say document dot query selector, and let us search for something with an ID of bar. Let us set its width to percentage scrolled. Let me use template strings here. And add a percentage sign like this. So here we are dynamically changing the width of the progress bar based on the percentage by which we have scrolled from the top. So now we are done with the implementation. Let us give this a preview. So now as we scroll, you can see this thick line is going from left to right. And if we do the complete scroll, it goes to the complete right? So you can see everything works like a charm. Let us move forward to our 7th project. So moving to the 7th project, in this project we will be making an infinite scroll app using intersection of server API. In one of my earlier videos, we made an infinite scroll application that utilized the scroll event. In this project, we will apply the intersection of server API to implement this. So let us head over to app.js file. So let us first add an event listener on the window object and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once the DOM content gets completely loaded, let us trigger the function initialize app. So right here, let us define the initialize app function. And the very first step here is to define an observer using the intersection observer API. So let us set up an observer using the intersection observer API. So const observer new intersection observer. Now let us use the observe method on the observer, and using this we can monitor when we are at the end of the page, and then we can do something. So let us make the observer watch this paragraph tag with an ID of end of page which says loading. So let me grab this selector and let us make the observer watch this target element. So observer dot observe, and here we need to specify a target element. So document dot query selector hash end of page. Next, let us invoke a function add items that I will define in just a minute, which for the very first time will add 10 items to the DOM, and later when we scroll down and reach the end of the page, which is marked by this paragraph, we will then add the next batch of 10 items and so on using the intersection observer API. Now before defining the add items function, let us go to our intersection observer line 4, where we are instantiating a new instance of intersection observer, and within the parentheses we will receive the entries array. So whenever the user reaches the target element that we are observing, the callback that we pass here gets fired and we get new entries. So let us log them to the console. Next, let us iterate over the array of entries that we got in the callback. So entries dot for each entry, and for each entry we need to check whether it is intersecting with the root or not. So if the entry is not intersecting, so we have an is intersecting property on each entry that we get, and we are applying a bang on this to check whether it is not intersecting. So if the entry is not intersecting with the root, then let us simply return. Else if we have the intersection with the root, this means that we are at the end of the page, and let us call the add items function to add the next batch of items to the DOM right after an interval of 2 seconds. So set interval and call the add items function like this. So now we are done with our observer code. Let us implement the add items method that we want to run once at the start to add the first batch of items, and next when the observer watches the target element, that is when we are at the end of the page, where it runs the add items for the next time, and so on. So let us see the code for add items function. So right here, first let us define a couple of variables. So we first need to define the count of items that we want to display in the viewport each time. So const count, set this to 10. Next, let us define an index variable that we will use for adding next batch of items each time when we reach the end of the page. Let index, set this to 0. Now right here, let us add the add items function. And here let us create a document fragment. So document dot create document fragment, and let us store this in a variable const fragment. Next, let us add a for loop, and using this loop we will add 10 items at a time to our DOM. So let us write a for loop for let I as index plus 1, and I will go till index plus count and plus I. Now the very first thing to do inside the loop is to create a div element. So document dot create element, and let us store this in item variable, so const item. Then to this div let us add some classes, and these are the tailwind CSS classes. So item dot class list dot add. So the first one says that on the large screen we want a width of 1/4 of the viewport, so 1/4. Then let us add the second class. On the medium screen I want a width of 1/2, or half the width of the viewport, and next we want a padding of 4 units all around and a full width for the item. Next, let us prepare some template for our item. So item dot inner HTML, set this to template strings, and here let me get the markup from the course files. So let me paste it right here, and finally attach this item that we just prepared as a child element of the fragment. So to the fragment let us apply the append child method and pass the item that we just prepared like this. Now this loop will run 10 times and add 10 items to the DOM right within the fragment that we just prepared. So now we are having all the 10 items getting appended as a children element of the fragment. Now once the loop condition breaks, we come out of the for loop, and now we need to attach the prepared fragment as a child of the div with the ID of item holder. So document dot query selector hash item holder dot append child, and add the fragment to this. And if we give this a preview in the browser, you can see we are getting the first 10 items getting rendered in the browser. Now lastly, let us update our index variable by count, so we can start adding next batch of items when the add items is called the next time. So the first batch of items index variable will be 0. So for the second batch of items, we update the index variable to 10 by saying index plus equal to count, and so on. So let us preview what we get in the browser, and let us scroll down. So you can see we are getting loading, and then we get the next batch of items, and we keep on getting an intersection observer entry in our console. So you can see everything works like a charm. Let us move forward to our 8th project. Now our 8th project is going to be very simple one. Here we will just play with text using the buttons like making the text bold, italic, underline, and reversing the text, changing the font size of the text, and you can then disable them as well. So feel free to try this on your own. Let us start coding this out. Now let us first add an event listener on the window object and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once that happens, let us run the function initialize app. Now let us also query select the h6 tag. So this h6 tag is present within the container that we want to work on. So this refers to the text that we want to change, like increasing the font size, making it bold, italic, and so on. Next, let us define our initialize app function. And as the first thing here, let us create a populate font sizes drop down function. And the idea here is to create a select box with different font sizes by first creating options and then adding those options in this select form control. So right here, let us add the function populate font sizes drop down. Now the very first thing is to reach out to the DOM and grab a reference for the select form control. So let us select it by using the name attribute that we have on the select form control. So let me grab this and paste it right here and wrap this in square braces. And this will give us the select form control. Now the next step is to populate the select box with different font sizes. And let us vary the font sizes from 0 to 100. So for let I as 0, I less than equal 100. And let us make use of the step size of 2. Now let us create an option element. So const option document dot create element. And each time we create an option element, we add a size to it, which is referred by this counter variable or the loop variable. So option dot inner HTML and set this to I. And now append the newly created option to our select box. So select dot append child and add the option as a child element of our select form control. Next, let us define the do event bindings function to bind the events to our UI elements. So right here, let us define the do event bindings function to register a couple of event listeners on our UI elements. So let us reach out to the DOM and grab a reference for the select form control and wrap this in square braces. And on the select form control, let us listen for the change event. So add event listener. And once that happens, let us trigger the function change font size. So right here, let us define the change font size function. And let us change the size of the text that we have in the h6 element to the value that the user select from the select box. So currently you can see we are having the values in our select form control. If we select one value, we want to reflect that value as font size for this text. So to achieve this, let us say h6 dot style dot font size, and in order to grab the value that the user selects, we can extract that from the event object that gets raised once the change event occurs on the select form control. So let us say event.target.value and concatenate to this pixels like this, or let us make use of the template strings. So wrap this in curly braces, apply a dollar and backticks, and then add px like this. So let us give this a preview in the browser. So let us select a font size, and you can see that is getting applied on our h6 element. Next, let us register a couple of event listeners on our buttons. So on each of these 4 buttons, we need to register a click event listener and make the functionalities corresponding to these buttons work. So let us reach out to the DOM and grab the button with an ID of bold. Let us add an event listener on this and listen for the click event. And once that happens, run the function make text bold. Then we want one for italic. Add event listener, click, make text italicized. Then one for underline, add event listener, click, make text underline. And finally one for reverse, dot add event listener, click, make text reverse. So let us go at the top and define each of these functions. So right here, let us define the make text bold function. And here let us call the apply or remove class function, to which we will pass a class that we want to apply on the text. So here we want to apply the bold class, which is present right here, which we have already defined in our CSS file, which sets the font weight to bold. So here we can say apply or remove class and pass bold to this. So we want to apply this class on the text. Now we will define this apply or remove class function in just a minute. But before that, let us create a similar function for italic, underline and reverse ones as well. So let me copy this, paste it 3 times down below, change this to make text italicized and pass here italic class, which we are having right here, that sets the font style to italic. And then we have one underline class as well that sets the text decoration to underline. So here we can say make text underline and pass a class of underline to this. And finally, make text reverse and pass a class of reverse to this. Now before trying this out, let us define the apply or remove class function at the top, apply or remove class. And here we will receive an input class as the argument that we want to apply on the text that we have in the h6 tag. So the very first step is to check whether our h6 does have the input class that we got as the argument. So h6.classList.contains input class. So if it does have that class already, then we can remove it from the class list of our h6 element. So h6.classList.remove and set the background color of the button to red to indicate that this input class is no longer present on our text. So let us try referring the button using the this keyword. So this.style.background color and set this to red. Else if our text doesn't have this class, let us add the class to the class list of our h6 element. So in the else case, h6.classList.add input class and set the background color of the button that was clicked to green. So to refer the button that was clicked, let us make use of the this keyword. Now here there is a gotcha that I will cover in just a minute. So for now, let us just set it like this and set this to green. So let us preview in the browser to see what we get. Let us click on make text bold and you can see it says cannot set property background color of undefined. So this error is coming at line 30. So you can see nothing works at this point. Now what is the reason for our code not working? So let us backtrack a little to spot the problem. Let us log the this keyword to the console to see whether it actually points to the button that was clicked or not. And if we preview, okay, so we are getting an error, add event listener of null. This should be italicized. So you can see this keyword points to the window object. So we are getting this on line 25. So this keyword here points to the window object and not to the button. So that is why we are not able to set the background color of the button to red if our h6 does contains the input class, or to green if the h6 doesn't contain the input class. So here the this keyword is pointing to the window object and not to the button element, and hence the output cannot set property background color of undefined. Now to make this work, let us head over to each of our functions and log the this keyword there to the console. So console.log this, then right here, and finally in our make text reverse function. And let us preview this in the browser. Let us click on make text bold and you can see on line 37, which is the make text bold function, that this keyword here points to the button object because we ran this function on the button object. But if we consider the apply or remove class function, here this keyword points to the window object. So on line 25, this is pointing to the window object. So for each of our 4 functions, make text bold, make text italicized, make text underline and make text reverse, that this keyword points to the button element. As you can see from the event bindings function, because we are applying the event listener on the button elements, and that is why the this keyword points to these button elements. Now what if we pass the this keyword that we are having in each of these 4 functions to the apply or remove class function as an argument, and instead use that in the apply or remove class function? So let us give it a try. So this, then here, and finally here. And now let us receive the this keyword as an argument in our apply or remove class function. So let us add it as the second argument and let us refer it using that. And now wherever we are using the this keyword, let us change it to that. Now let us preview this in the browser. So if I click on make text bold button, the background color is getting applied on the button. And if I again click on it, then the input class is taken away and it turns red. And for each of these buttons, everything works as expected. So you can see 3 of our functions are working as expected. Now let us make sure that the reverse function also does its job, because at the moment it is not reversing the text. And also check the font size functionality. So this looks good. So let us work on reversing the text next. So to make sure that the text gets reversed, let us set the inner text of our h6 element to its reversed version. So h6.innerText. So let us first convert the inner text, which is a string, to an array using array.from method. Next, call the reverse method on the returned array. Now on this reversed array that we get, let us convert this reversed array back to a string by joining the characters that we have in the array consecutively with each other using the join method, and pass a separator of single quotes. So let us finally test everything out, and let us click on reverse text. Let us increase the font size, and you can see everything works like a charm. So let us head over to our 9th project, where we will be making a simple custom search filter using JavaScript. Now let us move forward with our 9th project, and this is a custom search filter. Now there are a couple of functionalities that I want in this custom search filter. So we are going to make simple things list where we can add a thing. So if I say digital pen, click on add thing, and this gets added to the list of things. Then let us add a couple of more things. Say monitor, LED, TV, Ultra 4K LED, TV. Then we want the ability to delete a thing. If we click on delete thing button right here, it deletes the corresponding item or thing. Now if you want to search a specific thing from the list of things that we already have, say Ultra 4K LED like this, then monitor, LED TV. So let us start implementing this project. So I'm back in my Visual Studio Code, and in the folder 9 custom search filter, create a new file app.js, and let us first add an event listener on the window object and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once the DOM content gets completely loaded, let us run the function initialize app. Next, let us query select all the UI elements that we want to work with. So we first want the list, so const list document query selector dot list. So here you can see the list has a class of list. Then we need the search input that has an ID of search. So let us query select that, const search input document query selector hash search. Next we need this span tag, which says no items present in the list, as an initial message when we don't have any item in our list. So for getting the span tag, let us say const span document query selector span. Now right here, let us define the initialize app function. And call the doEventBindings function right here. So now let us define the doEventBindings function to bind events on our UI elements. So let us register our event listeners on the UI elements. So first on the search input, let us listen for the key up event. And once that happens, let us trigger the function filter things. So let me write a comment here, filter things. Next on the form, let us listen for the submit event. And once that happens, let us trigger the function create thing. So creating a thing. Finally, on the list, let us register the event listener for the click event. And once that happens, let us call the delete thing function. So deleting a thing. So first, let us define the create thing function, and this will receive the event object. So create thing. Let us prevent the default behavior of the form submission. For this, let us say event.prevent default. Next, we need to grab the input value from the input form control that we have in the form, which is this field. So we need to grab the value that the user writes in this field to create a new thing. So for this, we can say document query selector hash thing, which is this input field that we have inside our form. We need to get the value that the user types in there, and let us store this in a variable const thing name. Now if the thing name wasn't specified by the user, then let us trim the value and check for the length property, and if it is 0, let us return. So let me wrap this in a if statement and return if this is the case. So if the user doesn't specify anything within the input field, then we simply return from the function without doing anything. Else if we do have some value in the input as the thing name, then let us create an HTML template for the thing and add it to our list. So let HTML and use the backticks, and let me write some markup here. So li class thing. Then let us add a span tag. And this should have the class of thing name. And here we interpolate the thing name that we are getting right from the input. Next to this, let us add a button to delete the thing. So delete thing. So now we are done with the template of our thing. So for adding the thing to the list, let us concatenate the prepared element to the inner HTML of the list, like this. And let us hide the span tag which says no items present in the list, because we now have at least one item in our list. So span dot style dot display, I set this to none. And finally, let us set the input field to its original state by setting its value property to empty quotes. So document query selector hash thing dot value, and set this to single quotes. So let us give this a try. Let us write the name of the item, so digital pen, and click on add a thing. Okay, so let us see what went wrong. It says filter things is not defined. For now, let us comment these two event bindings and let us go back. Okay, so form is not defined. So here we need to say const form document query selector form. Okay, make a hard refresh. So now let us create a thing. So digital pen, click on add thing, and now you can see it works. So now we are done with creating a thing. Let us move forward to see how we can filter things based on the search term that the user writes in the search input box. So let me uncomment this line. So right here, let us define the filter things function, and let us use an arrow function for this, though you can use a normal function as well, and this will receive the event object as the argument. Now to get the search term from the input field that the user writes in this field, let us say event.target.value, and whatever the user writes, let us convert this to lowercase by using the toLowercase method, and whatever we get from the input field, let us store this in a variable term. Next, let us grab all the list items that we have in our list. So const things document query selector all, and here say li. Next, let us iterate over all the things that we just got. So things dot for each thing. So for each thing, let us grab the title of the thing, which we can get by saying thing dot first element child dot text content, and let us store this in a variable thing title. So for each thing we have this markup, if you say thing dot first element child, then this gives you the span tag, and within the span tag, if you look for the text content, then you get this thing name, right, which is the thing title. Next, we need to check whether the term that the user enters in the search input field is present within the title of the thing that we are currently on, which is this thing that we are getting as an argument right here. If this is the case, then we want to show that thing in our list. So if thing title, convert that to lowercase, and here we apply the index of method to see that whether the term that the user specifies in the search input is present within our thing title or not. So if this term is present in our thing title, which we can check by saying the index of is not equal to -1, then in that case we want to show the thing. So for that we can say thing.style.display, set this to block. Else if the search term that the user specifies in the search input box doesn't exist in the thing title, that is we are getting an index of -1 for this term in the thing title, then we can hide the thing that we are currently on. So thing.style.display, set this to none. So now we are done with the filter things function. Let us give this a preview in the browser. So let us add a couple of items. So digital pen, LED TV, smartphone, and let us try this out. So if I say and you can see the filter functionality works good. If I say LED TV, this works as expected. Now let us make sure that once the user clicks on the delete thing function, that thing gets deleted from our list of things. So right down below, let us create a function delete thing, and this will receive the event object. Now as a first step here, we need to check for the tag name of the target that the user clicked on. So if the user clicks on an element that has a tag name of button, so you can see if we add a new thing here, this element with the text delete thing is a button, so it should have a tag name of button. So if the target of the event is a button, then let us make sure that we can remove this item that holds this button, right? So the idea here is that if user clicks on an element that has a tag name of button, then we first need to find the parent element of the button that was clicked on. So this is the button. If you query for its parent element, then it is the li, and then if you again access the parent element of this, then you get the ul. And on the ul, let us make use of the remove method and delete the thing from the list. Simple enough, right? So let us try this out. So console log event.target.tagname. Let us uncomment this first. Let us add an item to the list and click on delete thing, and you can see the tag name is button. So if the target of the event has a tag name of button, then let us first find the parent element of the target, which is the li, and then the parent element of the li, which is the ul, and on the ul we run the remove method to remove the thing, and this is how we can remove the thing using the remove method on the unordered list. So from the button we go to the li, and from the li we go to ul. Now if after deleting all the things from the list we want to display our message of no items present in the list, then for this let us set the display property of the span back to block. So initially we set it to none right here. Let us set it back to block. So condition for this is if the list children.length is 0. So if we are having no items in the list, then let us render the message by setting the display property of the span to block. So let us give this a preview in the browser. Let us add a couple of items. Let us click on delete thing function. Let us try deleting the thing digital pen, and it gets removed from our list. Let us try the filter functionality. So A, B and R, A, and you can see this works great. So you can see everything works like a charm. So let us head over to our 10th project. Now as our 10th project, let us implement a sticky navigation bar. So here is the project demo. So if you scroll from top to bottom, you can see the navbar gets sticked at the top, and this is what we have to implement using JavaScript. So right here, let us add an event listener on the window object and listen for the DOM content loaded event. And once that happens, let us trigger the function initialize app. Now let us define a couple of variables. So first is navbar, document query selector, hash main. So the navigation bar has the ID of main. Then we have another variable const top of navigation, navbar dot offset top. Now right here, let us define the initialize app function, and inside it, let us invoke the do event bindings function that we will use to bind the events to our UI elements. So for the do event bindings function, we only need to register a single event on the window object. So window dot add event listener, and we have to listen for the scroll event. And once that happens, let us trigger the function make navbar sticky. So right here, let us define the function make navbar sticky. And within the function, we first need to check for the scroll position along the y-axis if that exceeds the offset position of the navigation bar. So if window dot scroll y, so the scroll position along the y-axis, if that exceeds the offset position of the navigation bar, which we can get by top of navigation, then let us give a padding top to the body. So document dot body dot style, and let us give this a padding of navbar dot offset height and pixels, and also add the class of sticky to the body. So document dot body dot class list dot add sticky, like this. Now let us go to the style.css file, and here you can see on the body we are having the sticky class. Now once the scroll position along the y-axis exceeds the offset position of the navigation bar, then we assign a class of sticky to the body, which sets its position to fixed. Else if we leave the scroll position, let us remove the sticky class and set the padding property of the body to 0. Document dot body dot class list dot remove sticky, and document dot body dot style dot padding top as 0. So let us give it a preview in the browser, and you can see everything works like a charm. So this was all I wanted to cover in this video. I sincerely hope you liked the complete video. In case you did, don't forget to check out my other playlists. The link for all of them can be found down below. Lastly, don't forget to subscribe and share the channel with your friends and colleagues, and let's catch up in the very next one.